morning. Welcome to the University of Virginia. I'm delighted to be here. This is about, I came to the university about a year ago and absolutely love it. So this will be a bit of a different talk than the kind of talk I normally give, in the sense that I'll talk a lot more about personal experiences and my kids, which is always I'm happy to talk about. I get to show pictures of my kids, so that makes me very happy. But I also wanted to introduce my wife and partner in all things, Annie Pelphrey. Wait. So she's the more shy person of this couple, and so she's not speaking today. I get that honor, but she's the real expert, so okay. So, seemingly a lifetime ago, in 2003, we published this paper, and the way scientific discoveries work, if we published it in 2003, we were working on it, in 2000, 2001, 2002, if not earlier. And so this was something I worked on prior to having any kids, and the work established that, or began to establish, that human beings have parts of their brain that allow them to understand other people, and that brain system is on par with other systems that we already knew about for many, many years. It was a new opening into kind of how do we process social information, and the fact that we actually have dedicated structures, just like we have brain structures for processing language, for high-level reasoning, for systems that are involved in reading. It was a new thing that we have systems that are dedicated to processing other people's actions, and then the sorts of things that allow you to understand when people are doing something on purpose versus accidentally, whether they mean to do you harm or be friendly, whether they're paying attention to you or not. So really basic aspects of social understanding. And as I mentioned, I did not have kids at the time and really didn't appreciate any significance of it beyond the basic science significance of trying to understand how the brain works. And that's what I was fascinated by, and that was my obsession and intense and repetitive interest, and I was perfectly happy doing that. And so, and fortunately, it helped me get a job in the psychology department where I was, paid to do what I love and spend many, many hours a day on it. At the time, other people were recognizing the significance of this potentially for autism, because in autism, as we all know, differences in how kids with autism, adults with autism perceive social interactions are characteristic of the condition. And so I was being approached to study autism, and sometimes I would dabble in it a bit, but it seemed way, way, way too complicated. Why would I do such a thing? And scientists, we're motivated by our intense and repetitive interests and things that we find that we're good at. And I wasn't good at conceptualizing a very variable, heterogeneous condition where there could be many, many causes, and it seemed like it was also a very controversial topic, and so I kept doing my basic science. And so then, this little girl was born. This is Frances. That's me when I had more hair and a lot less weight. But anyway, little Frances has this beautiful, beautiful smile. That's her English setter. That was actually my first child, named Jeremy, and she loved Jeremy and pretty much was constantly attached to him at all times. Frances had a typical, pregnancy. There were some indications that she might be a bit small for, gestation, but nothing too worrying. There was a point at which she was upside down and needed to be flipped, but that didn't quite work. But anyway, nothing too far out of the ordinary. And so when she was born, easiest baby ever. I remember thinking like, well, this was supposed to be hard, but she would sleep on time, and I know a lot of people in this room right now, given how hard it can be to get a child with autism to sleep, are rolling their eyes. But she would go to bed when we wanted her to. She would wake up when we wanted her to. Did well feeding, and seemed very, very interested in social interactions. And again, I had dabbled in autism, but by no means was studying it at the time. And over time, we realized that our very, very easy baby, in some ways, was too easy. That she wasn't really hitting some of her milestones. I was a developmental psychologist, which qualifies me to do really nothing in terms of parenting, but I at least knew. I actually liken it to, no offense to hairstylists in the room, but hairstylists like to experiment, and often hairstylists don't have the best hair. Psychologists like to experiment, and often psychologists have the most difficult children. Frances was very, very easy, but she wasn't hitting a lot of her milestones, and we were concerned, and so we were going to our regularly scheduled appointments and mentioning this. And at the time, I should say, I was in North Carolina. I worked for Duke University, and I had trained at the University of North Carolina. And if you know about kind of the resources around the country for autism research, that's one of the best in the world. And I had trained with Joe Piven, who was the leading researcher in the world on autism. And so, but my understanding of developmental psychology, that Frances was a girl and that she was seemed very interested in social interactions, smiled when we played with her, never really thought autism. In fairness to Joe, we never asked him to kind of look at Frances and talk to Frances in that way. But our pediatricians were saying, well, she's a girl, she'll catch up, which is actually really the opposite. But again, I'm not beating up on the pediatricians. It's a point that I'll get to, that oftentimes girls present differently, and we know a lot more about that. And so Frances wasn't necessarily presenting with like a boy would with autism, and so no one was really thinking autism. So she was behind in language, behind in some milestones, behind in walking, things like this, but seemed very, very social. And my understanding of autism was, well, it's a social disorder, first and foremost, and Frances loves interacting. So this question of, why more autistic boys? So if you don't know, about 4 to 1 more boys than girls with autism. And part of that is very likely to be a real aspect of biology. But part of it we know now is whether or not we're good at, well, that we're not very good at necessarily catching girls with autism. And in part, that's because the research tools we've developed for doing diagnosis were normed primarily on boys. And the vast majority of the studies that we've done have been done with boys with autism, in part because of this difference in ratio between boys and girls. And then it kind of, I've drawn these gears because it's sort of a cyclic process that keeps focusing more and more on boys with autism, because that's who we can identify, and then that's who we study. And if there's real sex differences in how boys and girls who are going to develop autism develop, then that makes it even more difficult, and we don't catch them. So this keeps happening. So this is really important, not just because, for Frances, I should say, we didn't hear the word autism until she was almost 3. And so, but she was going to different occupational therapy, speech language therapy, but very non-specific, more just what we could sort of get her into without the diagnosis of autism, but nobody, including myself, was thinking autism. And so the reason why this is significant, not just for my family, but for all families, is that if they're not receiving that clinical diagnosis, oftentimes they're getting a lot of inaccurate diagnoses, they're getting a lot of, it's required of the girls to cause more trouble oftentimes in order to get to that diagnosis. Like a good indicator of getting a diagnosis for a girl with autism is often emotion regulation difficulties once they hit school, which is very late down the road, when they really start to stand out. And that was certainly true with Frances. And ultimately, this is a missed opportunity. So there's this long period of time when they're not getting the right interventions. And ultimately, with the different mix of potentially inaccurate diagnoses, it puts them at even greater risk for victimization, given the sort of trajectories that they're put into in terms of how we as a community provide interventions. And so, for example, I'm going to jump around a little bit, but in Frances's case, a key moment in our family's life was when they told us that they were going to have Frances in the behaviorally educationally handicapped class in Cary, North Carolina. And I had grown up there, and I knew what that class was like from my experience. And it was a mix of kids who had real developmental conditions, kids who were thrown in there because didn't know what else to do with them, kids who had major psychiatric conditions, and very, very problematic. And the idea of that crushed me. Sorry. And so that set us on a trajectory to start thinking, well, what else could we look for Frances, and what else could we get? So kind of jumping back a little bit in time. Ultimately, this idea that it took so long for us to hear the word autism, so we didn't hear that word until Frances was just about to enter kindergarten, and that's when the school system presented to me that they were going to put her in this class, which I was very concerned about. And in part, because they didn't know what else to do, and we didn't have any sort of firm diagnosis. Sorry, I usually don't talk about anything emotional during my science talks, so threw me for a loop for a minute. But what I did as a scientist in kind of reaction to this, and it took a little while to find the opportunity, that's why I say I'm bouncing around in time a bit. But one of the things that we've done is to put in, there are these autism centers of excellence throughout the country, and UVA is now one of those, an NIH-funded autism center of excellence. And we lead up a network as the lead site that includes Yale, Boston Children's, University of California, Los Angeles, University of California, San Francisco, Denver, Colorado, and Children's National in Washington, D.C., who are all collecting massive amounts of data at every level of analysis, from genes to molecules to brain systems to behavior to environments, and focused on getting equal numbers of boys and girls in this sample. And so we started this about 7 years ago now. And when these kids, equal numbers of boys and girls, hundreds of them, were around 7 to 12 years of age, and now we're following them up. And what's really cool about this, jumping kind of to the end of my talk, is that they're young adults now, and that's another group of people that we don't really know anything about, young adults with autism, and especially that transition out of school into the world, like what can we do? How can we help that happen? And so we knew nothing about that, and we did, especially for girls. And so what this data set's going to allow us to do is to begin to understand how girls with autism present, how it's different, and how the causes of autism might actually be different in boys and girls, which is something that really blew my mind. So let me show you an example of that. So a lot of the work that we do involves brain imaging, so taking pictures very rapidly of the brain in action and actually understanding how different neural systems are communicating with each other over time. And one of the things that we can do is simply ask somebody to lie down in the MRI magnet. How many of you have had an MRI? Okay, wow. All right. So, it's becoming a very common thing. It's not the funnest thing in the world, but, it can be tolerated. And so they're lying in the magnet and they are just resting and thinking about whatever they want to think about. And we can then, at rest, characterize brain networks and communication. And what we're doing in our Autism Center of Excellence is actually having the brain systems tell us by this activity what is different between boys and girls, typically developing, different between boys and girls with autism, typically, and then comparing each one of those groups to typically developing boys to boys with autism, typically developing girls to girls with autism. And then we get these networks that mean a lot to a neuroscientist in terms of, this is the system that is different in girls with autism relative to typically developing girls. And this is the system or systems that are different in boys with autism versus typically developing boys. So it's, what does the brain look like given that you have autism or you're an individual living without autism? Now, to make this interpretable, what we did was take each of those systems, you think about it as pixels on a television screen, but in 3 dimensions. And what is that pixel, what does the literature say that it does in terms of a psychological construct? And so I've created these wordles to show you, for girls, these are the constructs that have underlying brain systems that characterize what's different in girls with autism relative to typically developing girls. And you'd be hard-pressed to see any of the DSM criteria in that wordle. Thinking about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, thinking about this, it's like we've got this behaviorally defined condition that we do incredibly rigorous diagnosis to say, this person has autism, this person doesn't, and they've all had that procedure, and then we're putting them in the magnet, and we're saying, brain, tell us how you're different. And then we average over those brains, and we say, as a group, how are girls with autism, how are their brains different boys? And for boys, it reads just like this diagnostic manual. Social perception is different, person perception. Language is in both groups, comprehension, the usual things, cognition, self-referential cognition. But the point being that for girls, this is a very different cluster of brain systems. So what I'm suggesting is that even though behaviorally you have the same condition, the underlying brain systems driving it are different. And so it stands to reason, and we're testing this now, that if you want to intervene in terms of helping an individual with autism achieve an optimal outcome, one thing that you should maybe utilize is knowing whether they're a boy or a girl, and knowing that statistically you might want to focus more on emotion regulation, anxiety, attention, for example, versus boys, where we could focus on things that we've long focused on, but that it suggests that girls, in order to really make a difference, are going to require a different system to be targeted. And you think about this in the field of medicine, how many conditions can you think of where the treatment would be different and the causes, the brain systems, the organs involved, would be different for the same condition? For example, heart disease certainly presents differently in boys and girls, but the underlying mechanism of causation is the same. Here I'm suggesting the underlying mechanisms might be different, and that surprised me greatly, but didn't surprise me in terms of my understanding of Frances. These are the things Frances really struggles with. She's fantastic at aspects of social understanding. It's actually her obsession. She loves watching movies. She loves understanding the different nuances that occur between characters. She can repeat whole movies. When she wants to understand something that happens to her, she understands it in the context of movies that she's seen. That's not quite the same as a natural, fluid, just, I can tell some people are nodding off, and so I should pick it up a little bit. But if I had to actually interpret it through the lens of a movie I've seen, Bueller, like that would be, and she just got into Ferris Bueller. So, okay. One of the things that we're doing, that I'm very glad that we're doing in this most recent round of this Autism Center of Excellence, is actually talking to people with autism and asking them to be part of the research that we're doing. So this is a partnership with the Autism Self-Advocacy Network and some non-affiliated individuals with autism as well, where they're actually coming in and serving as researchers. And so we've created this one thing that I think is really cool, this kind of interview around the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which is one of the gold standard ways that we diagnose autism. And we're actually doing this intensive cognitive interviewing with our autistic self-advocates as they go through it to try to understand how they're interpreting the questions and the activities that are being done. So that's been really amazing. One of the things that's come out is this concept that we hadn't thought of before. This autistic inertia is what our self-advocates have described it, where it's this sort of elements of executive dysfunction and low energy, hypotonia that is not, I had always thought of hypotonia in terms of muscle development. Francis suffered from hypotonia, still does. But this is beyond that into the adult stages of development, where there's this mismatch between one's will and what one can sort of make one's body and mind do. And that's fascinating. So we're following it up. So it's an example of when we actually include autistic researchers, we can begin to get at concepts that we wouldn't have thought of and start to study them intensely. Okay, so more pictures of Francis. So I mentioned that Francis spoke very late. It was very difficult for her to start speaking, sorry. And so this is Francis meeting elements of the Wiggles, and the Wiggles was her favorite show, and perhaps our first indication that Francis had some really intense repetitive interests. And so I can't tell you how many Wiggles and Imagination Movers concerts I've been to. It's like I'm a deadhead at this point, but for Imagination Movers. And I think the Imagination Movers are starting to get a little scared of me. But Frances was first into the Wiggles, and her first word was Henry. And so Frances, she would get really excited when Henry the Octopus would come on screen. And so I ordered her a Henry the Octopus doll. And those were actually out of circulation at that point, so I don't want to admit how much I paid for it on eBay. Out there's somebody making a list of the things that I buy. Like, he's a child neuroscientist. And so we got Henry, and Henry arrived and opened Henry, and she was just ecstatic. And a relative teased her and said, "I'm going to take Henry." And she said, "My Henry, this is my Henry, get back," and started running around the room. And at the time, both running and speaking were kind of unheard of for her. And so it shows, kind of that element of motivation. Ron Suskind talks about this in terms of affinities. And, Frances certainly has a lot of affinities. One is for pink. Frances is very much a girly girl, but now Imagination Movers. And it's funny kind of watching her taste in movies change over time. She's finally hit on 80s movies, so we're really, really happy because, right, this is cool. Although we're shocked at the fact that any of those movies were ever allowed. Like today's climate, not so much. We have to tell Frances, when you go to school, you can't quite act out The Breakfast Club. That's just not going to work. But so kind of relating back, an issue, once we got a diagnosis of autism, the way that happened was that we started to hear, autism a little bit when we were in North Carolina, and then the folks at Wake County Public Schools were saying, we think this classroom would be appropriate for her. And at about that time, I had gotten an offer to move to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And in academia, when you're young and moving up in the field, it's opposite of everything else in the business world. Like, you go explore things because that's how you scare the university, and then they give you stuff to stay. So it's sort of bizarre. Loyalty is not rewarded. But so I went and looked, and I saw this classroom. And if you don't know, Carnegie Mellon pretty much invented cognitive science and developmental cognitive work. And the classroom was run by a student of John Anderson and Donald, sorry, I'm blanking. I'll remember the name if I don't try to. But a Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist who was at Carnegie Mellon. And my first psychology book was by John Anderson. And so we were doing the job interview, and Sharon, the director of the school, said, I understand you have a daughter who would be entering into kindergarten, and she showed me the school, and I fell in love with it. And so I started crying during a job interview. I guess I cry a lot. But she doesn't, but I do. So Sharon was like, if you want your daughter to go here, we'll get her a spot. And there was like a 2-year waiting list. And so I took the job on the spot. And I came back and explained we're moving to Pittsburgh. And so we did, and then, and that was great. When we got to Pittsburgh, that school was absolutely fantastic. And Frances blossomed in many ways. She absolutely loved it. She started making her first real friends. Her first best friend was a little Korean boy who couldn't speak English. The Carnegie Mellon's a very international school, and he would come over and have play dates, and neither one of them could speak English, so it was sort of perfect. And they just played with, and he liked the Wiggles, and he called her Franny Monster. I think that was his first English word. But Franny Bear and Franny Monster, depending on how mad he was at her at any particular time. But the point being that I was fortunate to be able to kind of know, this school, while not specializing in autism, I knew enough about the science behind it and the person that I had met to know that it would be a good school for her. Now, the problem was it only went through the end of first grade, and so once we got to Pittsburgh, we got the kind of initial autism diagnosis. Probably autism, I think, was the way it was put. And Pittsburgh is a fantastic place if you're an adult with autism. They actually have great services, which is sort of unusual, but not really for kids with autism. And so as we started looking around, there were a lot of, frankly, quacks that were practicing, and it was really difficult territory to navigate. And then on my 8th month there, a man named Ami Clinton called and said, we have an opening at the Yale Child Study Center, and I've been following your work, and I would like to recruit you. And I remember I hadn't been doing autism research. I had gotten out of it, and Carnegie Mellon had no interest in me doing autism research. It's a very distinguished psychology department. They don't really do much applied clinical work. They don't have a clinical psychology department. And so Ami is probably the very best diagnostic person in the world, and Fred Volkmar is child psychiatrist there. And I knew of the Yale Child Study Center from like a storied history. I had thought about going to the psychology department there for a faculty position, and I had met those guys long before autism was on my radar. They were just amazing. And I did not cry in front of Ami, but Ami said, we have this endowed chair, and we want you to move here. And I said, well, I just actually got a diagnosis for my daughter, and Ami is very socially skilled and astute. And he said, oh, well, bring her next week, and Fred and I will see her, and then we'll take it from there. Maybe you'll be interested in this position. And so I accepted the position when I got there. And then I moved to Yale, and I was there for about 10 or 11 years, and it was wonderful. Now, the issue with my concern with the Yale Child Study Center, great place for diagnostics, but not necessarily for intervention. Like you go there and you get a 30-page suggestions, but there aren't that many resources. Now, fortunately, there's great interventions and services for young kids with autism, but we're sort of looking, down the road, what's going to happen. And also, given that Annie is from Virginia Beach, we wanted to be down in this area ultimately. And so, the scientific point though is that the question that I was trying to figure out, while Francis was getting great autism-specific intervention in Connecticut, was, well, how do you know what works and what doesn't work? And so we were a lucky family. We could try everything, and we knew nothing was going to hurt her per se, as far as evidence-based interventions. But if we weren't such a fortunate family, I knew how much these interventions costs, and like, well, how do you figure that out for other families who can't just spend money on an intervention that may or may not be the right one for their kid? So one of the things that we developed that I'm proud of at Yale was using brain imaging to predict which behavioral intervention would work well for a given child and why. And so just to show you that science, one intervention that we studied is called pivotal response training. And I don't have a horse in that race as far as the different evidence-based interventions. My own personal opinion is that all of them, as long as they have evidence, are options, and you kind of look and see what works best. I want to answer what might work best for a given child. Interventions work in a variable way. So what this graph is saying is that some kids get a lot better. Actually, going down on this graph is doing better, fewer symptoms. Some kids do about the same or a little worse. And on average, the red line, kids do better on this evidence-based intervention. So this is a behavioral intervention. It's ABA inspired, I would say. And so that's not news. What was news was that we could use brain imaging to predict very precisely which kids would benefit. And what was exciting about that is we offered this 16-week intervention for free, but it would cost you about 30 grand in the community. And one of the parents can't work because it's about 40 hours a week. If there's only one parent, then, okay, well, you do the math. So you can't just play around. And so what we were excited about was both being able to predict, but also being able to say why. I won't go into what each of these brain systems do. If I did, you'd sort of roll your eyes and be like, well, yeah, no wonder it predicted. But the point is, well, now, what if I tell a parent, your child isn't a good candidate for this, right? And so bear in mind, this is still research, so it's not in clinical practice yet, but we're hoping to get to that point. But if I get to that point and then I say, your child isn't a good candidate for that, it's like, well, thanks, I know what not to do now. But what about what to do? Well, because we have an idea of where in the brain predicts, we know a lot about those brain systems. We know about the underlying genetic expression, what neurotransmitters happen there, when in time they develop, and how to modulate them, how to alter their activity. So one of the things that we're doing now is using intranasal oxytocin to actually modulate that activity, with the prediction being that kids who aren't good, won't be good responders, we can turn them into good responders. And so we know we believe we can supplement the therapy with a medication before each session. And so that's what we're trying now. So last thing that I want to show you is this question of, first, these are all 5 of our kids. And so one person who I haven't talked about, Lowell, who's right there being choked. So ultimately, we want to be able to do things very, very, very early in development, right? Going back to early infancy, the day kids are born. And I have methods that are very Ferrari-esque, and Annie won't let me get a Ferrari. But because they wouldn't fit in it, that's the sole reason. And then my point being that, we have these methods that are very intensive, and we need to develop things that are more family-friendly, kid-friendly, like the Vanagon, which is still a very cool car, and it's coming back, but it's not a Ferrari. So now we're doing these early imaging studies. This is Lowell getting his first scan, and we put him in the magnet, but ultimately we want techniques like optical imaging, for example, and electrophysiology that we can do with very young babies. And we're developing those techniques now and actually partnering with folks in the NICU here in the hospital and developmental peds generally, so that we can start to use some of our methods to create early markers of developing autism and early indicators of which treatments would be best. So stay tuned for that. And this is relevant to Lowell because Lowell was born while while I was at Yale, and I enrolled him in an early follow-up study, a prospective longitudinal study, as a control participant because there was no indication that anything was amiss from very early on. And ultimately, while he was in that, things became concerning, and he got this intensive early intervention overseen by Kasia Trawoski, who's a fantastic clinician focused on early development. And Lowell is what we would call an optimal outcome child. He just got the highest score in the state test for science. He's a little shy. He likes public speaking, but he doesn't really like chit-chat. And so, basically, he's definitely my child. And, so stay tuned for what we're doing there. And the last thing I want to show you is really both with the early baby stuff, but also Frances now is 16. She just turned 16. She's fascinated by the Breakfast Club, and she does a perfect Ali Sheedy imitation. And so, as we're kind of looking through this future-oriented, what I'm particularly excited about in terms of my collaborations here is this kind of beautiful alignment, which I haven't seen anywhere else, of School of Education, School of Medicine, even the law school being interested in autism, a president of the university who is really an expert on neuroscience and education and developmental disability law. Like, it's the ultimate situation. And so thinking now for Frances about the community to create, where she's doing quite well, but she's always going to need supports, and helping her to access and develop those supports that she would be really benefiting from. And so that's what we're really up to now and what I'm most excited about. So hopefully I left a couple minutes for questions. Okay. Talked longer than I thought I would, but most of it was having to pause to not cry. So. Actually, before I take questions, one thing I want to point out is that when I start to tear up, it's not because of bad memories or pain or I do worry about all of my kids, but it's more of just a lot of emotion behind it, but not I'm the luckiest person on earth to have the 5 kids that I have, and all of them are absolutely amazing. And all of them have their own struggles, and actually the middle one, he's concerned because he doesn't have enough struggles, but it's kind of... So questions? I think we have microphones and...
Oh, I have one.
Yep.
I don't need a microphone, I got a big mouth. But one of your earlier slides showed the neurological differences differences between genders, between the
Yep.
male and the female subject. But how young are you doing the research so that you don't have a interference of social constructs?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that study, those were all pre-teens, but all school-age kids and older. And so now what we're wanting to know is, do we actually see over the development prior to autism symptomatology presenting, are we seeing sex differences in development? Because your point is, and it's a very valid point, being a girl with autism in the world could shape your brain differently. And what we're seeing is at least as much the brain being shaped as it is what's driving any real sex differences. And that's particularly important because, and it fits with the literature that we have about girls with autism, that they're much more susceptible to then going on to develop depression, anxiety, because of the world that they're having to live in, the gender-based socialization. Boys can be much further off socially than, this is stating the obvious, than girls, and it not be a problem for them. It's like, I won't make any references to politics, but it's very clear. And so, it's shaping as much as it is driving.
So you talked a lot about early intervention. Can you talk about what has changed since you started in this research when it comes to neuroplasticity in adolescents?
Oh, sure, yeah. So thank you. That's my favorite topic. What strikes me is we were very concerned that we had missed the boat with Frances. And what I'm coming to understand as a neuroscientist now is that there's another boat that comes along, and as a father, I understand this, of adolescence, where everything's changing, and it's an amazing opportunity. And what's different from early intervention is that the child, now young person, has a say and can really help shape their direction. And that's an amazing opportunity. I think about how we structure society in terms of steering our kids towards college. In part, it's because we want to delay that adolescence and open them up for maximal plasticity so that they take in as much as they can from the world and start to make their own decisions about what they want to hang on to. And that, I think, has a biological basis in terms of how the adolescent brain is increasing its plasticity at that time. And when you look at the neuroscience behind that, it's clear that, yes, very early in development is still very important, and we had to emphasize that as a scientific community to help push forward policy recommendations. But the next wave, I think, is really pushing forward, how do we utilize that adolescent plasticity? And I like to think, too, that middle age is another period of increased plasticity. Red sweater? Yeah, so what we're looking at is, oh, yes, ma'am. So what's our transition plan? And, so Frances is what I think people would characterize as somebody who is fairly high functioning, but will require quite a bit of support. And so, we don't think she's going to go, and she doesn't want to go immediately into college. We think that there's going to need to be a kind of a post period of what is getting more similar to a college setting, an independent setting, in between her graduating high school and beyond. My attitude towards high school and middle school has always been, I believe, even just from my own experience, sans autism, is that you have a lifetime to learn facts. And I've wanted her to learn strategies to deal with real world things, an understanding of how important academics is, but I'm not worried about her grades. And then what I want intact at the end is her sense of self-esteem and self-motivation. And I don't think that has anything necessarily to do with autism. That's what I hope for any middle school and high school kid, but particularly for her. we've been focused on trying to drive that. So what we're thinking about as a transition plan is a part-time job, which is going to be interesting because I have spoiled her rotten, and she's like, I can be the manager, right? No. But a part-time job combined with some college-esque experiences, and then more intensive summer experiences where she's going away to sort of transition programs to help her. And then we hope that we can, get her into a college setting that'll be very appropriate for her. And then from there, I don't know, it worries me every day. So, one more question, or okay, blue vest.
I have a quick comment, and then I'm going to go to a question that's in a different direction. But the comment is simply, my son showed a lot of the things that you have from female, and he wasn't diagnosed until 6. And the report across the
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But my question, I was really intrigued by your phrase autistic inertia.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if you had time to speak a little bit more.
Sure. It's not my phrase. This came up by working with autistic self-advocates who are researching with us. And so it's, my understanding is the description of wanting to move forward, even planning, but this sense of something pushing back on you. They were very clear to say it's not like depression, it's not anxiety, it's just how do I get going? And it's a motor component as much as a mental component. And so that, for a lot of reasons, intrigues me.